In the tranquil village of St. Mary's, a vicar is found dead, strangled with his own sacred stola, chilling act that shatters the peace. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle demeanor hides a razor-sharp mind as she unravels the secrets of the vicarage where a reserved wife, an ambitious curate, a fervent organist, and a dreamy ward harbor hidden passion's clues like a locked diary, a lavender scent, and a stray button weave a web of deception. In this tale of faith and betrayal, only Miss Marple can untangle the truth before the killer strikes again. Chapter 1. The quiet village of St. Mary's. Village of St. Mary's, drowsed under a pale autumn sun, its thatched cottages and winding lanes exuding a timeless serenity that belied the stirrings of human passion. Ivy clung to the weathered stones of the church, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. At the heart of the village stood the vicarage, a sturdy Georgian house with mullioned windows, its garden a riot of late-blooming roses. Here, in this haven of quiet piety, Miss Jane Marple found herself a guest, her visit prompted by a letter from her old friend, Mrs. Margaret Clement, wife of the rector. Miss Marple sat in the rectory parlor, her small, bird-like figure almost lost in the chintz-covered armchair. Her hands, delicate but sure, held a cup of Earl Grey, and her clear blue eyes, undimmed by age, took in every detail of the room, the slightly faded wallpaper, the ticking of the mantel clock, and the nervous flutter of Mrs. Clement's fingers as she poured a second cup. The rector's wife was a plump, kindly woman, prone to gentle gossip, but today her chatter faltered, her face clouded with unease. "It's dreadful, Jane, simply dreadful," Mrs. Clement said at last, setting down the teapot with a clink. "Reverend Hargrove found this morning, in his own study, dead. They say he was strangled with his stole." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls might overhear. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind quickened. Reverend Thomas Hargrove, Vicar of St. Mary's, was known to her only by reputation a scholarly man, gentle in manner, whose sermons drew even the most reluctant villagers to church. His death, and in such a violent manner, was a jarring note in the village's tranquil melody. "How very shocking," she murmured, her tone inviting confidence. "Tell me, Margaret, what happened?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her eyes wide. It was Mrs. Hargrove who found him, poor soul. She went to call him for breakfast, and there he was, slumped at his desk. The stole, that purple one he wore for services, was wound so tightly around his neck. "Oh, Jane, it's too horrible. To think of Inspector Craddock's there now, asking questions, but the village is in an uproar. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. The stole, a sacred vestment, suggested a crime of peculiar intimacy, committed by someone familiar with the vicar's life and duties. "And who was in the vicarage this morning?" she asked, her voice mild but probing. Mrs. Clement hesitated, then ticked off the names on her fingers. "Well, Mrs. Hargrove, of course, Eleanor, such a quiet woman, always so proper. Then there's Mr. Denning, the curate, a young man with big ideas about the parish. Miss Vane, the organist, was about early, practicing for Sunday, I believe. And Lily, the vicar's ward, lives there too, a sweet girl, but a bit flighty. Oh, Jane, it's unthinkable that any of them could. But who else could it be?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew a skein of wool from her knitting bag, her hands moving with the rhythm of long habit. "People are often more complex than they seem, Margaret," she said, her eyes resting on a sparrow hopping across the lawn outside. "In my little village of St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small resentments can fester, how secrets hide behind the most respectable faces." Mrs. Clement shivered, pulling her shawl closer. "You'll go to the vicarage, won't you, Jane? Inspector Craddock's a good man, but he's from the county, not one of us. You've a way of seeing things others miss. Miss Marple smiled. A faint, enigmatic smile that had unraveled many a mystery. "I shall pay my respects to Mrs. Hargrove," she said. "A tragedy like this touches everyone, and it's only neighborly to offer comfort." As they finished their tea, the church bell tolled, its mournful note echoing across the village. Miss Marple set down her cup, her mind already turning to the vicarage and the puzzle awaiting her. St. Mary's might appear a haven of peace, but she knew better than most that even the quietest villages harbored shadows, and it was in those shadows that the truth of Reverend Hargrove's death would be found. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. Miss Jane Marple stepped lightly across the gravel path leading to the vicarage, her black lace-up shoes crunching softly in the crisp autumn air. The morning sun cast long shadows over St. Mary's, gilding the ancient yews in the churchyard and lending a deceptive warmth to the somber occasion. Beside her, Mrs. Margaret Clement clutched her shawl, her face pale with the weight of the morning's tragedy. The vicarage loomed ahead, its red brick facade solid and unyielding. Yet the drawn curtains at its windows hinted at the grief within. Miss Marple's clear blue eyes, sharp as ever, despite her years, took in every detail: the neatly trimmed rosebushes, the faint scuff of mud on the doorstep, and the faint hum of voices from inside. A crime had been committed here, and she felt the familiar stir of curiosity, tempered by a quiet sorrow for the loss of Reverend Thomas Hargrove. Inspector Craddock met them at the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame, a man in his early 40s, with a square jaw and a manner both brisk and courteous. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod of recognition. They had crossed paths before, in other villages, where death had disrupted the ordinary rhythm of life. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "Mrs. Clement said you'd be along. I trust you'll keep your observations discreet." His tone held a trace of wry amusement, for he knew her knack for seeing what others missed. "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "I've only come to offer my sympathies to Mrs. Hargrove, but if I can be of any small assistance—" Craddock's lips twitched, but he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The vicarage hall was dim, its oak-paneled walls absorbing the light from a single chandelier. A constable stood guard at the foot of the stairs, his notebook open, his pencil poised. Mrs. Clement hesitated, but Miss Marple moved forward with quiet purpose, her eyes scanning the polished floorboards and the faded runner that led to the study. A faint scent of beeswax polish lingered, undercut by something sharper: fear, perhaps, or the metallic tang of tragedy. The study door stood ajar, and Craddock led them inside. The room was modest, almost austere, its walls lined with bookshelves, crammed with theological tomes and volumes of poetry. A heavy oak desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with papers, a quill pen, and a cup of tea, long gone cold. Reverend Hargrove's body had been removed, but the chair where he had been found remained askew, its leather upholstery worn from years of use. The purple stole, a liturgical vestment rich with embroidered crosses, lay coiled on the desk like a serpent, its silken sheen stark against the grim purpose it had served. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, her mind noting its significance. A sacred object turned profane. "No signs of a struggle," Craddock said, his hands clasped behind his back. "No overturned furniture, no scratches or bruises on the vicar, save for the marks on his neck." The stole was knotted tightly, but the act was swift. He didn't fight back. He pointed to the desk. "We found a half-written sermon, a diary-locked mind you, and a few personal effects. Nothing obviously out of place." Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes tracing the room's details. The window overlooked the churchyard, its latch secure, the glass unmarred. A single curtain was slightly askew, as if someone had brushed against it. The fireplace was cold, its grate clean, suggesting no recent fire. A brass paperweight, shaped like a cross, sat heavily on the sermon notes, and a small photograph in a silver frame caught her eye. A younger Reverend Hargrove, smiling beside a woman who must be Eleanor, his wife. The frame was tilted slightly, as if recently handled. Was the door locked when Mrs. Hargrove found him? Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively casual. Craddock shook his head. No, it was ajar, just as we found it. She says she came to call him for breakfast at 8 o'clock and found him, like that. She screamed, alerted the household, and sent for the doctor and the police, and the others in the house. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for use, but she kept her hand still, her attention fixed on Craddock. Mrs. Hargrove says she was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The curate, Mr. Denning, claims he was in his room upstairs, working on a sermon. Miss Vane, the organist, was in the church, practicing, though no one can confirm that. And Miss Ward, the vicar's ward, says she was reading in her room. None of them heard anything unusual, or so they claim. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving a pattern from these threads. A quiet death, she murmured, yet so deliberate. The stole. It's a curious choice, don't you think, Inspector? Not something one picks up by chance. It was his, wasn't it? Craddock confirmed with a nod. His liturgical stole, worn for services. Kept in the vestry, usually, but he brought it here sometimes for private prayer. Whoever used it knew where to find it. Mrs. Clement, who had been silent, wrung her hands. It's sacrilege, Jane, to use a holy thing for such a purpose. Who could be so wicked? Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. Wickedness, Margaret, often wears a familiar face. In my experience, the most shocking acts come from those closest to us, driven by motives we scarcely guess. She turned to Craddock. May I look at the desk, Inspector? He hesitated, then nodded. Be my guest, but don't touch anything. The lads from the county are still dusting for prints. Miss Marple approached the desk, her movements slow and deliberate. The sermon notes, written in a neat, precise hand, spoke of forgiveness and redemption, the text breaking off mid, for we are all sinners, yet in repentance we find. The ink was dry, the quill resting beside it. The locked diary, bound in black leather, intrigued her most. Its clasp was sturdy, suggesting secrets worth protecting. She leaned closer, noting a faint scratch on the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open. Has this been opened yet? She asked. Not yet, Craddock replied. We're waiting for a locksmith. Mrs. Hargrove says she doesn't know where the key is. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Curious, she said, almost to herself. Her gaze shifted to the teacup, its contents clouded with milk. Cold tea, she remarked. He didn't drink it. Was it his habit to take tea while working? Craddock shrugged. Mrs. Hargrove says he often did, but she didn't bring it to him this morning. She assumed he'd made it himself. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the household's routines. A vicarage was a place of order, yet this morning's chaos suggested a disruption deeper than murder alone. She stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room once more. A small rug near the desk was slightly rucked, as if someone had stood there, shifting their weight. A single petal from a rose, wilted and brown, lay near the window, out of place in the otherwise tidy room. She made no comment, but her memory catalogued it. Jane, Mrs. Clement, whispered, her voice trembling. Do you think it was someone in the house? It's too awful to imagine. Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. We mustn't jump to conclusions, Margaret. But a crime like this, it's personal. The stole, the quiet of the act, the familiarity of the setting, it all points to someone who knew the vicar well, someone who moved freely here. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You're thinking one of the household, then? I'm thinking, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, that we must look at everyone who crossed this threshold. People are not always what they seem, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a churchwarden who seemed the soul of propriety, yet he pilfered from the collection plate to fund his sister's medical bills. Small secrets lead to larger ones. Craddock's expression softened into a grudging smile. You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I'll have my men question the household again, and we'll get that diary open. If there's anything in it, I'll let you know. Known officially, of course. Of course, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling faintly. She turned to Mrs. Clement. Shall we pay our respects to Mrs. Hargrove? A widow needs comfort, and perhaps she'll share more than she realizes. They left the study, Craddock lingering to confer with the constable. The vicarage felt oppressively silent, its usual warmth chilled by death. As they passed through the hall, Miss Marple noticed a coat rack by the door, heavy with cloaks and scarves. One scarf, a fine woolen thing in deep green, was slightly askew, its end trailing on the floor. She paused, her fingers brushing the fabric lightly. Mrs. Clement, she said softly, does Mr. Denning wear a green scarf? Mrs. Clement frowned, thinking, I believe he does. He's often seen in it, especially on cooler mornings. Why do you ask? No reason, Miss Marple said, her tone airy. But her mind was anything but idle. A scarf out of place, a petal. On the floor, a locked diary. These were the threads of a tapestry yet to be woven. She thought of the vicar, a man of faith, struck down in his sanctuary. The stole, she mused, was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, chosen with intent. Was it anger, fear, or shame that drove the killer's hand? And what had the vicar known that made his silence so necessary? As they approached the drawing room to meet Mrs. Hargrove, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Eleanor Hargrove, the dutiful wife, whose grief might mask deeper feelings. Philip Denning, the ambitious curate, whose modern ideas clashed with the vicar's traditional ways. Clara Vane, the organist, whose devotion to the church bordered on fanaticism. And Lily Ward, the vicar's ward, whose dreamy demeanor might conceal a secret worth killing for. Each, Miss Marple knew, held a piece of the truth, and it was her task to fit those pieces together. The drawing-room door opened, and Eleanor Hargrove's pale face greeted them, her eyes red-rimmed but composed. Miss Marple smiled gently, her heart heavy with the knowledge that truth, when uncovered, often brought as much pain as it did resolution. But uncover it she would, for St. Mary's, like St. Mary Mead, hid its secrets in plain sight, and Miss Jane Marple was never one to let them pass unnoticed. Chapter 3. The suspects. Miss Jane Marple sat in the rectory's small morning room, a modest space with faded floral curtains and a single window overlooking the churchyard. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender from a bowl on the sideboard, and the faint tolling of the church bell marked the hour. Mrs. Clement had excused herself to confer with the cook about luncheon, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and her knitting. The needles clicked rhythmically in her hands, a soothing counterpoint to the whirl of her mind as she considered the murder of Reverend Thomas Hargrove. The vicarage, only a stone's throw away, seemed to loom larger now, its walls holding secrets she was determined to unravel. Inspector Craddock had sent a constable with a preliminary report, a gesture Miss Marple appreciated, though she knew it was more courtesy than necessity. The report confirmed what he had told her in the study: no fingerprints on the stole, no signs of forced entry, and no witnesses to any unusual activity that morning. The vicar's death was a puzzle wrapped in the ordinary, and Miss Marple knew that the key lay not in grand gestures, but in the small, human details of those closest to him. She had asked Craddock to arrange discreet meetings with the 4 souls who had been in or near the vicarage at the time of the crime, and he had agreed, albeit with a bemused shake of his head. You've a way of getting to the heart of things, Miss Marple, he'd said, and she had smiled, saying nothing. Her first task was to understand the suspects, to see them not as names on a list, but as people with motives, fears, and hidden desires. She closed her eyes briefly, picturing the vicarage household as a stage. Each player with their role, their secrets waiting to be glimpsed behind the curtain. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, the vicar's wife, was the picture of propriety, yet Miss Marple had learned in St. Mary Mead that propriety often masked deeper currents. Mr. Philip Denning, the curate, was young and driven, his ambition a spark that could ignite conflict. Miss Clara Vane, the organist, carried the intensity of a woman whose life revolved around the church, perhaps too fiercely, and Miss Lily Ward, the vicar's ward, was a cipher. Her youth and dreaminess a veil that might conceal more than it revealed. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Clement returned, her face flushed from her exertions. "Jane," the inspector says, "you can speak with them at the vicarage this afternoon. He's set up a room for you, nothing formal, just a quiet chat," he says. "Oh, but it feels so strange, questioning our own neighbors like this." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up with a gentle smile. "It's not questioning, Margaret, merely listening. People tell us so much more than they intend, if we only give them the chance. Now, tell me about these four. You know them better than I do." Mrs. Clement settled into a chair, smoothing her skirt with nervous fingers. "Well, let's see. Eleanor Hargrove, such a reserved woman, always so proper. She's kept the vicarage running like clockwork ever since. They came here 10 years ago. Never a hair out of place, though I've always thought she seemed lonely, perhaps. The vicar was devoted to his work, you see, always visiting the sick or writing his sermons. I don't think they were close, not in the way you'd hope." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring the image of Eleanor's pale face in the drawing room, her hands steady despite her grief. "And Mr. Denning, the curate. Oh, Philip Denning's a bright young man, full of ideas. He came to St. Mary's about a year ago, straight from theological college. Wants to modernize things, more youth groups, livelier hymns. The vicar wasn't always keen, I hear. Philip's got away with people, though, especially the ladies." Mrs. Clement's voice dropped conspiratorially. "There's been talk about him and Mrs. Tate, the widow who lives by the mill. Nothing proven, mind you." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, but she kept her tone light. A curate must be careful of gossip, and Miss Vane, the organist. "Clara Vane's been here forever," Mrs. Clement said, her lips pursing. "She's 40, I'd say, and lives for the church. Plays the organ like an angel, but she's got a sharp tongue. Doesn't suffer fools, and she's not fond of Lily Ward, thinks the girl's too flighty for the vicarage. Clara's always there, polishing pews or arranging flowers, as if the church is her own." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Devotion can be a powerful thing," she murmured, "but it can turn to obsession. And Miss Ward, what of her? Lily's a dear girl, only 20, and the vicar's ward since her parents died years ago. She's lived at the vicarage since she was 12, treated almost like a daughter. She's quiet, always sketching or reading those romantic novels. The vicar was strict with her, wanted her to marry well, but she's got a dreamy look about her, as if her heart's elsewhere. There's a young man in the village, Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, who's been seen near the vicarage. People talk, you know." Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "People always talk, Margaret. The trick is knowing which whispers matter." She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements spry despite her age. "I think it's time. I paid my respects at the vicarage. A cup of tea and a kind word can work wonders." The afternoon was cool as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, her black coat buttoned against the breeze. The village was subdued, its usual chatter hushed by the weight of tragedy. A few villagers lingered near the church gate, their heads bent together, and Miss Marple caught fragments of their talk, speculation about the stole, whispers of scandal. She passed them with a polite nod, her mind already fixed on the task ahead. At the vicarage, a maid ushered her into a small parlor, where Inspector Craddock had set up a makeshift interview space. The room was cozy, with a low fire crackling in the grate and a tray of tea things on a side table. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair, her handbag at her side, and waited. She knew the value of patience, of letting people fill the silence with their truths. Her first visitor was Eleanor Hargrove, who entered with the measured grace of a woman accustomed to duty. Her dark dress was immaculate, her hair pinned tightly, but her eyes were shadowed, and her hands clasped a handkerchief as if it were an anchor. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "it's kind of you to come. This is a difficult day." "My dear Mrs. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her tone warm with sympathy, "I can only imagine your shock, to lose your husband so suddenly, and in such a way." She let the words hang, watching Eleanor's reaction. Eleanor's lips trembled, but she nodded. Thomas was a good man. Everyone loved him. "I don't understand who could do this." Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the handkerchief. Betraying her tension, Miss Marple poured tea, the act a quiet invitation to talk. "He was much respected, I hear. A man so devoted to his parish must have been a comfort to you." Eleanor hesitated, her gaze dropping to the cup. "He was absorbed in his work. The parish came first, always. I managed the vicarage, kept things in order. It was enough." Her words were careful, revealing little, but Miss Marple noted the absence of warmth, the hint of a life lived in parallel rather than together. They spoke briefly, Eleanor offering polite but guarded answers about the morning's events. She had been in the kitchen, she said, preparing breakfast as usual. She had not heard the vicar rise, nor had she seen anyone enter the study. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind noting the woman's restraint, the way her eyes avoided the photograph on the mantella, younger Eleanor, smiling beside her husband. Next came Philip Denning, the curate, whose entrance was marked by a nervous energy. He was tall, with dark hair and a boyish charm that belied his serious cassock. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking her hand with a grip too firm, "I hope you're not here to play detective. The inspector's got enough on his plate." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I'm far too old for such games, Mr. Denning. I only want to understand the vicar better, through those who knew him. You worked closely with him, I believe?" Philip sat, his hands restless on his knees. "I did. He was a fine man, but set in his ways. I thought we could reach more people. Bring the church into the modern age." He didn't always agree. His voice carried a trace of frustration, quickly masked. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Young men often see new paths. Were you in your room this morning, working on one of those modern sermons?" He flushed slightly. "Yes, upstairs. I didn't hear anything. The vicarage is quiet in the mornings." His eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of lavender on his cassock, a detail that stirred her memory of Mrs. Tate. Clara Vane followed, her angular frame rigid as she sat across from Miss Marple. The organist's eyes were sharp, her mouth set in a line of disapproval. "I was in the church," she said without prompting, "practicing for Sunday. I always do, at dawn." The vicar liked the organ to be perfect. Her voice held a note of pride, but also something fiercer, almost possessive. "You must have been devoted to him," Miss Marple said gently. "A man of such faith inspires loyalty." Clara's jaw tightened. He was a saint. Not everyone appreciated him, some in this house, especially. Her glance toward the door suggested Lily Ward, and Miss Marple tucked the hint away. Last was Lily Ward, who drifted into the room like a wisp of cloud. Her pale hair was loose, her eyes wide and nervous. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I don't know what to say. The vicar was like a father to me. I was in my room, reading, when it happened." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her eyes missed nothing. The faint bruise on Lily's wrist, the way her fingers plucked at her sleeve. "You poor child," she said. "It must be hard, living here now. Did you see anyone this morning? Perhaps someone unexpected? Lily shook her head, her cheeks flushing. No, I stayed upstairs. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple sensed a truth unspoken. As Lily left, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting idle. 4 suspects, each with their own story, their own silences. Eleanor's cool detachment, Philip's restless ambition, Clara's fierce devotion. Lily's nervous secrecy. They were pieces of a puzzle, and the vicar's death was the dark heart of it. She thought of the stole, the locked diary, the lavender scent, and the rose petal on the study floor. Small things, but in St. Mary Mead, small things had led her to murderers before. She rose, her resolve firm. The vicarage held its secrets tightly, but Miss Jane Marple was adept at coaxing them into the light. Chapter 4. The vicar's wife, Miss Jane Marple, walked slowly along the path from the rectory to the vicarage, her small figure wrapped in a woolen shawl against the chill of the late afternoon. The sky above St. Mary's had turned a muted gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the village seemed to hold its breath, as if wary of what secrets might yet spill forth. Her conversation with the suspects had left her with a tapestry of impressions, each thread vibrant but incomplete. Now, she sought a deeper understanding of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, the vicar's widow, whose composed exterior hinted at depths. Marple. Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that a wife, even one so seemingly dutiful, could harbor resentments as silent and deadly as a winter frost. The vicarage door was opened by the same maid, a young girl with red eyes who bobbed a curtsy before leading Miss Marple to the drawing room. The room was elegantly austere, its walls adorned with watercolors of local landscapes, and a single portrait of the late Reverend Hargrove, his stern gaze softened by a faint smile. A fire burned low in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the polished furniture. Eleanor Hargrove stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the gathering dusk. She turned as Miss Marple entered, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped before her in a gesture of quiet control. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft, "it's kind of you to call again. Margaret Mrs. Clement, you might wish to speak further." She gestured to a pair of armchairs by the fire, and Miss Marple settled into one, her handbag resting on her lap like a trusted companion. "I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her tone warm with sympathy. "In times of loss, a friendly face can be a comfort, and I've always found a cup of tea helps to steady the nerves." She nodded toward the tea tray, which the maid had set out, its silver pot gleaming in the firelight. Eleanor managed a faint smile and moved to pour the tea, her movements precise but mechanical. "You're very kind," she said, handing Miss Marple a cup. "I'm afraid I'm not myself today. Thomas's death, it's left everything in disarray." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. The widow's hands were steady, but there was a tightness about her mouth, a shadow in her gray eyes, that spoke of more than grief. "It must be a terrible shock," Miss Marple said gently, "to find him so suddenly, and in such a way. I understand you were in the kitchen when it happened." Eleanor nodded, settling into the opposite chair. "Yes, I was preparing breakfast. Thomas liked his routine tea and toast at 8, no matter the day. I went to call him, and her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands, where the handkerchief was now a crumpled knot. I saw him through the study door, slumped in his chair. I thought at first he'd fainted, but then I saw the stole." She shuddered, her composure slipping for a moment. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as a whisper. "How dreadful for you, my dear, to see him with that stole, such a sacred thing, used so cruelly. Did he often keep it in the study?" Eleanor's eyes flickered, and she hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. He'd bring it from the vestry for private prayer, especially during Lent or Advent. It was special to him." Her words were careful, and Miss Marple noted the slight pause, as if Eleanor were weighing what to reveal. And this morning, Miss Marple continued, you saw no one else about? The vicarage is such a busy place, with Mr. Denning and Miss Vane and young Lily all coming and going. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. No, I was alone in the kitchen. Philip Mr. Denning keeps to his room in the mornings, working on his sermons. Clara is usually at the church, and Lily, well, she's often in her own world, reading or sketching. I didn't hear anything unusual. Her voice was firm, but her fingers tightened on the handkerchief, betraying a tension she could not fully mask. Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her bag, began their quiet dance, the soft click a counterpoint to the crackling fire. A vicarage is like a little village in itself, she said, her tone conversational. So many lives intertwined, yet each with its own private corners. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a vicar's wife, Mrs. Price. Her name was who kept everything running so smoothly, yet she confided once that she felt quite invisible. It's a demanding role, isn't it, being the vicar's wife? Eleanor's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of something perhaps, or weariness. It is, Eleanor admitted, her voice low. Thomas was devoted to his flock. The parish came first. Always. I managed the household, the teas, the charity drives. It was my duty. Her words were clipped, and Miss Marple sensed a thread of bitterness, quickly suppressed. Duty can be a heavy burden, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on her knitting. And sometimes, when one gives so much, one hopes for a little warmth in return. You and the vicar must have shared many happy years, though, to build such a life here. Eleanor's face softened, but only slightly. We were happy, in our way. When we married, Thomas was full of ideals, and I shared them. But over time, his work consumed him. The parish, his books, his sermons, he lived for those. I suppose I grew used to it. She looked away, toward the portrait on the wall, and Miss Marple followed her gaze. The young Thomas Hargrove in the frame seemed a different man, his eyes bright with hope, his arm around a smiling Eleanor. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. It's curious, isn't it, how marriages change. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a couple such a devoted pair, everyone thought, yet they drifted apart, each nursing their own disappointments. Did you ever feel, Mrs. Hargrove, that there was something troubling your husband of late, a worry, perhaps, about someone in the household? Eleanor's hands stilled, and her eyes met Miss Marple's, a flash of wariness in their depths. Thomas was always concerned for the parish, she said carefully. He worried about everyone, Mr. Denning's modern ideas, Clara's intensity, Lily's future. But he didn't confide in me, not lately. He kept his thoughts in that diary of his. Her voice held a trace of reproach, and Miss Marple noted it, filing it away like a scrap of wool for her tapestry. The diary, Miss Marple said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Locked, I believe. It must hold such precious memories of his work. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. He always locked it. I never saw the key. He said it was for his private reflections, things not meant for others' eyes. Her tone was neutral, but Miss Marple sensed a quiet frustration, as if the diary's secrets were a barrier between them even now. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to lighter matters, the village fete, the church, flowers, watching Eleanor's responses. The widow's composure was impeccable, yet there were cracks, the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief, the fleeting glance toward the door when a floorboard creaked upstairs. As Miss Marple rose to leave, her eyes fell on a small side table, where a photograph lay face down, its silver frame tarnished. She made no comment, but her mind registered it, a detail out of place in Eleanor's otherwise meticulous world. Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's chatter. I'll call again, if I may, to see how you're faring. Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of polite gratitude. Of course, Miss Marple, you're always welcome. As Miss Marple stepped into the hall, the maid closed the drawing-room door behind her, and the vicarage seemed to exhale, its silence heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eleanor's words, her careful omissions, the locked diary, and the photograph hidden from view. In St. Mary Mead, she had known women like Eleanor, women who bore their burdens quietly, yet whose hearts could hold a storm. Was Eleanor's grief genuine, or did it mask a deeper wound? And what of the diary, locked away like a confession waiting to be heard? Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the vicarage windows. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her mind weaving the threads of Eleanor's story into the larger pattern. The vicar's wife was a figure of duty, but duty, Miss Marple knew, could breed resentment as easily as devotion. She thought of the stole, its purple silk, a symbol of faith, turned to violence, and wondered what truths Eleanor Hargrove might be keeping from herself as much as from others. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple set her sights on the next thread in the tapestry. Mr. Philip Denning, the curate, whose ambition and secrets might hold the key to the vicar's death. Chapter 5. The curate's ambition. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the church vestry, where Mr. Philip Denning had agreed to meet her. The path from the vicarage wound through the churchyard, where ancient headstones leaned like weary sentinels under the wet yews. Miss Marple's umbrella bobbed above her, its black canopy shielding her from the damp, but her sharp eyes missed nothing: the slick moss on the stones, the faint footprints in the mud, and the distant figure of a woman hurrying away from the church, her head bowed against the rain. St. Mary's was a village of secrets, and Miss Marple felt them pressing closer with each step. The vestry door was ajar, and a faint glow spilled from within, mingling with the scent of old wood and candle wax. Philip Denning stood by a small table, sorting hymnals with a restless energy that belied the somber occasion. He was a striking young man, no more than 30, with dark hair that fell slightly over his brow, and a face that might have been boyish, were it not for the intensity in his green eyes. His cassock was neatly pressed, but Miss Marple noted a faint crease at the shoulder, as if it had been hastily donned. The scent of lavender clung to him, subtle but unmistakable, stirring a memory from the parish tea she had attended with Mrs. Clement. "Mr. Denning," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she closed her umbrella and stepped inside. "Thank you for sparing a moment. I know this is a trying time for everyone at St. Mary's." Philip turned, his smile quick but strained. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Mrs. Clement's friend. I'm happy to help, though I'm not sure what an old lady forgive me can do about this awful business." His tone was light, but his hands fidgeted with a hymnal. Betraying his unease, Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with a disarming warmth. "Oh, I'm quite harmless, I assure you. I only wish to understand the vicar better, through those who worked with him. You were his curate, I believe, a vital role in such a parish." Philip set the hymnal down and gestured to a wooden chair, taking the one opposite. The vestry was cramped, its walls lined with shelves of prayer books and vestments, a single candle flickering on the table between them. He said, his voice carrying a trace of pride. "Reverend Hargrove was a good man, a scholar, but, well, he belonged to an older generation. I wanted to bring fresh ideas to St. Mary's, more engagement, you know, with the young people, the workers. He wasn't always keen." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a familiar rhythm as she began to knit. "Young men often see new paths," she said, her tone conversational. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a young curate, once, Travers. His name was full of enthusiasm for change. He ruffled feathers, but he meant well." "Did you and the vicar ever disagree sharply?" Philip's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, his fingers tapping the table. Not sharply, no. He listened, but he had his ways. Tradition mattered to him, old hymns, old rituals. I thought we could do more, reach those who don't come to church. We had discussions, but nothing serious. His eyes darted to the candle, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush on his cheeks, as if he were holding something back. You must have spent much time together, she said, her needles moving steadily. A curate and a vicar, working side by side. It's almost like a partnership, isn't it? Did he ever share his worries with you, perhaps about the parish or the household? Philip hesitated, his fingers stilling. He was private about personal matters. He'd talk about theology, the Bible, but not his feelings. Lately, though, he seemed preoccupied. He mentioned something about moral lapses in the parish, but he didn't elaborate. I thought it was just his way of fretting over small sins. His voice was casual, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if the memory troubled him. She nodded, her expression serene. A vicar carries many burdens, and this morning, Mr. Denning, you were in your room at the vicarage, I believe, writing a sermon, perhaps one of those modern ones. Philip's smile returned, but it was forced. Yes, upstairs, working on a sermon for Sunday. I didn't hear anything, no shouts, no footsteps. The vicarage is quiet in the mornings, and my room's at the far end of the hall. He paused, then added, I came down when I heard Mrs. Hargrove scream. By then, it was too late. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes gentle but piercing. How dreadful it must have been, to think, someone entered that study, took the vicar's own stole, and, well, it's a bold act, isn't it? Almost as if they wanted to make a statement. She watched him closely, noting the way his hands clenched briefly, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. A statement. Philip echoed, his voice sharp. It's a sick mind that does something like that. The stole, it's sacred, part of the church. Whoever did this? He trailed off, shaking his head, but Miss Marple sensed the thread of fear beneath his indignation. Indeed, she said softly, it's curious, the stole being there at all. Mrs. Hargrove mentioned the vicar sometimes kept it in the study for prayer. Did you ever see it there? Philip's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing her question. Once or twice. He'd bring it from the vestry, if he was preparing for a special service. It wasn't unusual. His answer was quick, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze slid away, toward the vestry door. She changed tack, her voice light. You must be a busy man, Mr. Denning, with all your plans for the parish. I hear you're quite popular, especially with some of the ladies. Mrs. Tate, for instance, she spoke highly of you at the parish tea. The mention of the widow's name was deliberate, and Miss Marple watched his reaction with keen interest. Philip's face flushed, and he shifted in his chair. Mrs. Tate is a kind woman, devoted to the church. She's been supportive of my ideas. His words were careful, but the lavender scent seemed to grow stronger in Miss Marple's mind, a clue that tugged at her memory. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. It's a comfort to have such allies. In St. Mary Mead, our curate found great support among the younger set, though it sometimes led to misunderstandings. Gossip can be so unkind, can't it? Philip's laugh was short, almost brittle. Gossip's the lifeblood of a village, Miss Marple. I try not to listen to it, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with something akin to panic, and Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, as if keeping pace with her thoughts. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to parish matters, the choir, the upcoming fate watching, Philip's responses. He was charming, quick to smile, but there was a tension in him, a sense of something held tightly in check. As he rose to leave, promising to help with the vicar's memorial service, Miss Marple's eyes fell on his scarf, draped over a chair in the corner. It was green, finely woven, and slightly askew, much like the one she had seen in the vicarage hall. Thank you, Mr. Denning, she said, her voice warm. "You've been most helpful. I hope we'll speak again soon." He nodded, his smile tight, and left the vestry, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting idle for a moment, as she considered the young curate. Philip Denning was ambitious, charismatic, and she suspected hiding something. The lavender scent, the green scarf, his vague account of the morning, they were small things, but in her experience, small things often led to great truths. She thought of the vicar's diary, locked and silent, and wondered what moral lapses Philip might fear being exposed. The rain had stopped, and a faint light broke through the clouds as Miss Marple stepped outside. The church loomed above her, its spire a silent witness to the village's secrets. Philip Denning was a man with dreams, but dreams, she knew, could turn desperate when threatened. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen ambition curdle into something darker, and she sensed a similar shadow here. The stole, the diary, the scent of lavender, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Philip Denning, she felt certain, held one of the keys. With a quiet resolve, she turned her thoughts to Clara Vane, the organist, whose fierce devotion might conceal a motive as powerful as ambition. Chapter 6. The organist's devotion. The church of St. Mary's stood silent in the gathering dusk, its stone walls absorbing the last of the day's light as Miss Jane Marple approached. The rain had left the air fresh, with a hint of damp earth, and fading roses from the vicarage garden nearby. The great oak door creaked as she entered, her steps soft on the worn flagstones. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of polished pews and old hymnals. From the organ loft came the mournful strains of a hymn, the notes rising and falling like a lament. Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes adjusting to the dimness, and felt the weight of the church's sanctity violated by the act that had taken Reverend Hargrove's life. She climbed the narrow stairs to the organ loft, her hand steady on the rail, her mind alert. Clara Vane, the organist, was a figure she had glimpsed at the parish tea, a woman whose angular frame and sharp features seemed to carry the austerity of the church itself. Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that devotion, when fervent, could burn as fiercely as any passion, and she was eager to understand the woman who had served St. Mary's with such intensity. Clara sat at the organ, her hands moving with precision over the keys, her face illuminated by a single candle on the music stand. The hymn, "Abide with Me," filled the loft with its solemn cadence, and Miss Marple waited until the final note faded before speaking. "Miss Vane," she said softly, "what a beautiful rendition. You play with such feeling." Clara turned, her expression startled but quickly composed. She was a woman of about 40, her dark hair pulled tightly into a bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Her dress was plain, its high collar and long sleeves a testament to her ascetic nature. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice crisp, "I didn't hear you come in. I'm practicing for the memorial service. The vicar would have wanted it done properly." Her tone held a note of reverence, but also a challenge, as if daring Miss Marple to question her purpose. Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a narrow bench beside the organ. "Of course," she said, her voice warm. "Reverend Hargrove was fortunate to have someone so dedicated. I've always thought the organist is the heart of a church, setting the tone for worship. You must have been very close to him, in a way." Clara's lips tightened, and she adjusted her spectacles, her hands lingering on the hymn book. "Close? I suppose so. He was a man of God, a true shepherd. I respected him deeply. Not everyone did." Her voice carried a hint of scorn, and Miss Marple's ears pricked at the implication. She drew her knitting from her bag, the needles clicking softly as she began a new row. "It's a rare thing, such devotion," she said, her tone conversational. "In St. Mary Mead, we had an organist, Miss Bates. Her name was, who poured her soul into the music, but she could be fierce about the church, almost protective." "Did you feel that way about Reverend Hargrove?" Clara's hand stilled on the hymn book, and her eyes narrowed. He deserved protecting. He was a saint, Miss Marple, a man who lived for his faith. But there were those who didn't understand, those who brought distractions into his life. Her voice trembled with suppressed emotion, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers gripped the book, her knuckles whitening. Distractions? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild, but probing. A vicarage is a busy place, I imagine, with so many coming and going. Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Denning, young Lily H., with their own demands. Clara's gaze sharpened, and she leaned forward, her voice low. Lily Ward, especially. She's a flighty girl, always sketching or daydreaming, no respect for the vicar's work. He was too kind to her, treating her like a daughter when she brought nothing but trouble. And Mr. Denning's ideas, his modern nonsense, it upset the vicar. I could see it. Her words were clipped, her disdain barely concealed. Miss Marple. Needles clicked steadily, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. It must have been difficult, she said, to see the vicar troubled. Did he ever confide in you about these concerns? Clara hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the hymn book. Not directly. He was private, but I could tell he was worried. A few weeks ago, he asked me to pray for the parish, said there were temptations threatening its peace. I knew he meant more than he said. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, anger perhaps, or fear, in her eyes. You were in the church this morning, I believe, Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a breeze, practicing, as you are now. It's a quiet time, isn't it, when the village is just waking? Clara nodded, her posture stiffening. I come early, always. The organ needs care, and I like the silence. I was here from 6 until Mrs. Hargrove's scream brought me running. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor, as if the memory unsettled her. Such a shock, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. To think, someone entered the vicarage, took that stole, and used it so cruelly. It's almost as if they wanted to wound the church itself, don't you think? Clara's face paled, and her hands clenched a hymn book. It's blasphemy, she said, her voice fierce. That stole was sacred, a symbol of his calling. Whoever did this there, number Christian. Her eyes blazed, and Miss Marple saw the depth of her devotion, a fire that could consume as easily as it warmed. She changed tack, her voice light. You must know the vicarage well, Miss Vane, coming and going as you do. Did you ever notice anything unusual, perhaps someone visiting at odd hours, or a change in the vicar's mood? Clara's lips pursed, and she looked away, toward the stained glass window above the loft. I don't pry, she said sharply, but I've seen things, Lily, sneaking out at night sometimes, thinking no one notices, and Mr. Denning, always talking with that Mrs. Tate, laughing in a way that's not proper for a curate. The vicar saw it too, I'm sure. He was watching them all. Her voice held a note of triumph, as if she relished the thought of their exposure. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind cataloguing Clara's words. The organist's devotion to the vicar was clear, but so was her resentment toward Lily and Philip. Was it merely disapproval, or something deeper? Jealousy, perhaps, for the vicar's attention. She thought of the stole, its purple silk, a stark contrast to the violence it had served, and wondered if Clara's fervor could have turned to vengeance. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to the church's routines, choir practices, the flower rota watching, Clara's responses. The organist was guarded, her answers precise, but her passion for the church shone through, a beacon and a warning. As Clara returned to the organ, striking up another hymn, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away. Thank you, Miss Vane, she said, her smile warm. Your music does the vicar's memory proud. I hope we'll speak again. Clara nodded, her fingers already coaxing the organ to life. the notes filling the church with a somber beauty. Miss Marple descended the stairs, her thoughts swirling. Clara Vane was a woman of fierce loyalty, but loyalty, she knew, could twist into obsession, and obsession into something darker. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a woman, Miss Hartnell, a stalwart of the parish who had guarded the church, like a fortress, her zeal masking a need for control. Clara's disdain for Lily and Philip, her protectiveness over the vicar, they were threads in the tapestry, and Miss Marple sensed they led to a truth yet hidden. Outside, the dusk had deepened, the churchyard silent, save for the drip of water from the eave. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small gate leading to the vicarage garden, its latch gleaming faintly in the fading light. She paused, noting a scrap of fabric caught on the hinge, a thread of green wool, like the scarf she had seen in the vestry. She made no move to touch it, but her mind filed it away, another piece of the puzzle. Clara Vane, Philip Denning, Eleanor Hargrove, and now Lily Wardshey would speak to the girl next, to unravel the dreams and secrets that might lie behind her quiet facade. The stole, the diary, the lavender scent, and now this thread, they were clues, small but significant, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to follow them to the heart of St. Mary's tragedy. Chapter 7. The Ward's Dreams. The evening had settled over St. Mary's with a quiet that felt almost oppressive, the village lights twinkling like cautious stars against the deepening gloom. Miss Jane Marple sat in the vicarage garden, a secluded corner where late roses clung stubbornly to life despite the autumn chill. The bench she occupied was tucked beneath an arbor, its latticework draped with fading clematis, offering a view of the vicarage's back door and the path to the church. She had arranged to meet Lily Ward here, away from the stifling formality of the vicarage parlor, hoping the girl's guard might lower in this softer setting. Miss Marple's shawl was drawn close, her knitting bag at her side, but her eyes were alert, scanning the shadows for clues as subtle as the rustle of leaves. Lily Ward appeared at the garden gate, her slight figure almost ghostly in the twilight. She was a delicate girl, with pale hair that caught the faint light and eyes that seemed too large for her heart-shaped face. Her dress was simple, a pale blue muslin that hung loosely, and her hands clutched a small sketchbook, its edges worn from use. As she approached, Miss Marple noted the hesitancy in her step, the way her gaze darted toward the vicarage windows, as if fearing observation. "Miss Ward," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and inviting, "how kind of you to join me. I thought the garden might be a pleasant place to talk, away from all the bustle. Do sit down." She patted the bench beside her, her smile as gentle as a grandmother's. Lily sat, her sketchbook resting on her lap, her fingers tracing its cover nervously. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "Mrs. Clemens said you wanted to see me. I don't know what I can tell you. It's all so awful. What happened to the vicar?" Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw the glint of tears in her eyes, quickly blinked away. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, "it's a terrible thing, losing someone who cared for you. I understand Reverend Hargrove was like a father to you, taking you in after your parents passed. That must have meant a great deal." Lily nodded, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "He was kind, but strict. He wanted the best for me, always said I should marry well, make a good life. He was good to me, really, but sometimes I felt—" She trailed off, her cheeks flushing, and Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her bag, began their quiet rhythm. "Sometimes one feels a bit caged, even by kindness," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a young girl, Lucy, her name was, who lived with her aunt, a good woman but very particular. Lucy longed to spread her wings, but she felt bound by duty. Did you ever feel that way, my dear?" Lily's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The vicar meant well, but he watched me so closely. He didn't like me going out much, or or talking to certain people. He said it wasn't proper for a girl in my position. Her fingers brushed a faint bruise on her wrist, half hidden by her sleeve, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered there, her mind alert. It's hard, being young in a house full of expectations, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. I hear you're fond of sketching. That must be a comfort, a way to escape into your own world. Lily's face brightened, and she opened the sketchbook, revealing delicate drawings of flowers, birds, and the church spire. I love it, she said, her voice gaining strength. The vicar let me sketch in the garden, but he didn't like me drawing people. He said it could lead to vanity. Her smile faded, and Miss Marple sensed a weight behind her words, a hint of rebellion suppressed. Your drawings are lovely, Miss Marple said, leaning closer to admire a sketch of a rose, its petals rendered with care. You have a keen eye. Did you sketch this morning, perhaps, or were you reading in your room as you said? Lily's hands froze, and her eyes darted away, toward the darkening garden. I was reading, she said, her voice faltering. In my room, upstairs. I didn't come down until I heard Mrs. Hargrove scream. Her fingers plucked at her sleeve, covering the bruise, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind turning to the village gossip about Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith's son. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone light. A quiet morning. Then, the vicarage must feel so different now, without the vicar. Did you ever see him in his study, perhaps with that stole he sometimes kept there? Lily shook her head, her hair falling across her face. Not often. He was private about his work, the stole. I saw it in the vestry sometimes, but not in the study. It's so horrible, what happened. Her voice broke, and she clutched the sketchbook tighter, as if it could shield her. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she leaned forward, her eyes kind but searching. It is horrible, my dear, to think someone used that stole something so sacred to do such a thing. It makes one wonder what the vicar might have known, what secret was worth such a desperate act. Did he ever seem worried to you, perhaps about someone in the village? Lily's eyes widened, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might speak, but the girl bit her lip and shook her head. He was always worried about the parish, she said, her voice small. He'd talk about duty, about keeping us all on the right path. But he didn't tell me much. He wanted to protect me. Her fingers brushed the bruise again, and Miss Marple's heart ached for the girl. Sensing a truth she was not yet ready to share, they sat in silence for a moment. The garden's quiet, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving together the threads of Lily's words, her nervous gestures, the bruise that spoke of something unspoken. She thought of the vicar's strictness, his desire to protect Lily, and wondered if it had clashed with a young heart's longing. The gossip about Tom Fletcher lingered in her thoughts, a possibility that might explain Lily's secrecy. You must miss him terribly, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. But you're a strong girl, I can see that. If you ever feel the need to talk about anything at all, I'm only at the rectory with Mrs. Clement. Lily nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, Miss Marple. You're very kind. She rose, clutching her sketchbook, and slipped back toward the vicarage, her figure fading into the shadows. Miss Marple remained on the bench, her knitting idle, as she considered the girl. Lily Ward was a dreamer, caught in a world of expectations she did not fully embrace. The bruise, the hesitation, the mention of certain people, they pointed to a secret, perhaps a forbidden attachment. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a girl like Lily, whose love for a man deemed unsuitable had led to tragedy. Was Lily hiding a similar story, one the vicar had discovered and sought to suppress? Her eyes wandered to the garden path, where a faint gleam caught her attention, a small button, mother of pearl, half buried in the dirt near the gate. She did not touch it, but her memory catalogued it, noting its delicate design, unlike the plain buttons on Lily's dress. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things could unravel great mysteries. She thought of the stole, the locked diary, the lavender scent on Philip's cassock, and the green thread on the church gate. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and Lily Ward, with her dreams and silences, was another dot. As she rose, the first stars appeared above St. Mary's, their light, cold, and distant. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vicar's diary, its locked pages a silent witness to his final days. What had he known about Lily, about Philip, about Clara, and what had driven someone to silence him with his own stole? With a quiet resolve, she set her sights on the diary, determined to uncover its secrets. The truth, she felt, was close, hidden in the ordinary lives of St. Mary's, and Miss Jane Marple was never one to let it slip through her fingers. Chapter 8. The diary's secret. The morning light filtered through the rectory's leaded windows, casting a soft glow across the breakfast room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with Mrs. Clement. The table was laid with simple fair toast, marmalade, and a pot of strong tea, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere, her mind weaving through the threads of the vicar's murder. The rain had cleared, leaving St. Mary's bathed in a crisp clarity. But the village's calm felt fragile, like a pond waiting for a stone to break its surface. Her conversations with Eleanor Hargrove, Philip Denning, Clara Vane, and Lily Ward had painted a picture of a vicarage filled with quiet tensions, each suspect a study in hidden motives. Now, her thoughts turned to the locked diary found on Reverend Hargrove's desk, a silent repository of truths that might unlock the mystery. Mrs. Clement, buttering her toast with a distracted air, broke the silence. "Jane, you're awfully quiet this morning. Are you still thinking about poor Reverend Hargrove? Inspector Craddock sent word that the locksmith's coming today to open that diary. He says you're welcome to be there, though I can't imagine what you expect to find." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over the rim of her teacup. "Oh, Margaret, diaries are such revealing things. In St. Mary Mead, our vicar kept one not locked, mind you, but full of little notes about the parish. They showed his worries, his hopes. Reverend Hargrove's diary might tell us what weighed on his heart before he died." Mrs. Clement shivered, setting down her knife. "It gives me the creeps, thinking of someone sneaking into that study, using his own stole." "Do you really think it was someone in the vicarage, Jane?" Miss Marple's needles, ever present in her hands, clicked softly as she considered her reply. "I think, Margaret, that the answer lies close to home. The stole, the quiet of the act, it speaks of someone who knew the vicar's habits, his world. But we mustn't leap ahead. The diary will tell its own story." An hour later, Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, where Inspector Craddock was overseeing the locksmith's work in the study. The room was much as she had last seen it, though the air felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. The oak desk stood solid, its surface still bearing the half-written sermon. The cold teacup and the black leather diary, its clasp gleaming dully in the morning light. The locksmith, a wiry man with deft fingers, was bent over the diary, his tools clicking as he worked the lock. Craddock stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice low. "You're just in time. Mr. Jenkins here says he'll have it open in a moment. I hope you're not expecting a confession written in bold ink." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair near the desk. "I expect nothing, Inspector, but I hope for clarity. A man like Reverend Hargrove, so private, would put his deepest thoughts in a diary, don't you think? Things he couldn't say aloud." Craddock raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his attention turning to the locksmith as the clasp gave a soft click. Jenkins stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "It's open, sir. No damage to the lock, as you asked." Craddock took the diary, his fingers careful as he lifted the cover. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes sharp. The pages were filled with the vicar's neat, precise handwriting, a blend of daily notes and reflections. Craddock flipped through, pausing at entries from the past month, and began to read aloud. His voice measured. September 12th, he began. The parish is restless. I sense a drift, a lack of focus among the flock. Philip's ideas, while earnest, risk diluting our traditions. I must guide him gently, lest he stir unrest. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling Philip Denning's restless ambition, his talk of modernizing the church. The entry confirmed a tension she had sensed, but it was the next one that sharpened her focus. September 20th, Craddock continued. A moral lapse weighs heavily on me. I have spoken with Philip, urged him to confess and seek forgiveness. His soul is at stake, yet he resists. I pray he finds the strength to choose the right path. Miss Marple's needles twitched, though they remained still. A moral lapse. Philip's affair with Mrs. Tate, perhaps. The lavender scent on his cassock, his nervous deflection. When questioned, they pointed to a secret he feared exposed. She glanced at Craddock, whose brow furrowed as he turned the page. October 1st, he read. Clara's zeal troubles me. Her devotion is a blessing, but it borders on the fanatical. She watches the household too closely, her judgments harsh. I must counsel her to temper her passion with charity. Clara Vane's fierce loyalty flashed in Miss Marple's mind. Her scorn for Lily and Philip, her possessive reverence for the vicar. Could her devotion have turned to something darker, a need to protect the vicar's sanctity at any cost? Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the stole, now stored in a police evidence bag on the desk. Its purple silk, a mute witness to the crime. Craddock turned to a final entry, dated the day before the murder. October 7th, he read, his voice slowing. Lily must be protected from her own heart. I fear she is drawn to one unworthy of her, a path that could lead to ruin. I have seen them together, and my duty is clear. I must act, though it pains me. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her thoughts racing to Lily Ward, her dreamy eyes, the bruise on her wrist, the village talk of Tom Fletcher. Had the vicar discovered a forbidden romance, one he sought to end? She pictured Lily's nervous hesitation, her quick denial of seeing anyone that morning. The diary's words were cryptic, but they hinted at a man who saw himself as guardian of his household's souls, a role that might have made enemies. Craddock closed the diary, his expression grim. That's the last of it. No names, no specifics, but plenty to chew on. What do you make of it, Miss Marple? She folded her hands over her knitting, her voice thoughtful. It's a window into his mind. Inspector Reverend Hargrove was troubled by Philip's choices, Clara's intensity, Lily's heart. He saw himself as their shepherd, but shepherds can be stern, and sternness breeds resentment. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a vicar who tried to steer a young man away from a bad marriage. It ended in harsh words, though not murder. Here, I fear. Someone felt cornered. Craddock nodded, his eyes narrowing. Philip's moral lapse sounds like he was up to something the vicar didn't like. And Lily could be this Tom Fletcher fellow the village is buzzing about. Clara, too, she's a fierce one. But nothing here points to who was in that study. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the desk, where the sermon notes lay unfinished, the ink dry on the page. Not yet, Inspector, she said softly. But the diary tells us the vicar was watching, judging, perhaps confronting, the stole. It's a symbol, isn't it? Someone used his own authority against him, someone who felt his judgment too heavily. Craddock rubbed his chin, considering. You're thinking it's personal, then, one of them, Melanor, Philip, Clara, or Lily, I think, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, that we must look at their hearts. The diary shows us what the vicar saw, but not what they felt. Philip's ambition, Clara's devotion, Lily's dreams, even Eleanor's duty, they all carry shadows. We need only find which shadow cast the fatal blow. As Craddock moved to confer with the constable, Miss Marple lingered by the desk. her eyes tracing the room's details. The rose petal she had noticed before was gone, likely swept away by the police, but its memory lingered. A small discord in the study's order. The photograph of the Hargroves, young and hopeful, stood tilted as before, and she wondered if Eleanor had touched it, perhaps in grief or regret. The diary's words echoed in her mind: moral lapses, fanatical devotion, a heart to be protected. Each suspect was bound to the vicar, yet each had reason to resent his scrutiny. She stepped into the hall, where the green scarf still hung askew on the coat rack, its woolen threads a silent question. The lavender scent, the mother of button in the garden, the green thread on the church gate, they were fragments, and Miss Marple felt them drawing together, pointing to a truth just out of reach. She thought of Philip Denning, his charm masking a secret affair, and of Clara's fierce protectiveness, her scorn for those she deemed unworthy. Lily's bruise and Eleanor's hidden photograph were pieces too, each a clue to the human frailties that had led to murder. As she left the vicarage, the church bell tolled, its note solemn and clear. Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The diary had spoken, but its secrets were only half revealed. She would need to tread carefully, to listen and observe, to coax the truth from the silences of St. Mary's. The next step, she decided, was to explore the lavender scent that clung to Philip, a thread that might lead to Mrs. Tate and the heart of the curate's moral lapse. With a quiet nod to herself, Miss Jane Marple set off into the village, her mind as sharp as the needles in her bag, ready to unravel the next knot in the tapestry of the vicar's death. Chapter 9. The lavender clue. The morning in St. Mary's was crisp, with a breeze that carried the scent of wet leaves and the distant temps of wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple walked along the village's main lane, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, though the sky was clear, its blue marred only by a few wisps of cloud. The events of the past days, the vicar's murder, the locked diary, the strained voices of the suspects had woven a complex web in her mind, and she felt the threads drawing tighter. The faint scent of lavender on Philip Denning's cassock, noted during their talk in the vestry, had lingered in her memory, a delicate but persistent clue. It reminded her of Mrs. Laura Tate, the vivacious widow who had been seen with the curate at the parish tea, her laughter bright and her perfume unmistakable. Miss Marple's steps were purposeful as she headed toward Mrs. Tate's cottage, her mind alert for the small details that so often revealed great truths. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, a charming affair with a thatched roof and a garden bursting with late asters. Its whitewashed walls gleamed in the morning light, and a curl of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting warmth within. Miss Marple knocked softly, her knock answered by a maid who ushered her into a cozy parlor. The room was a contrast to the vicarage's austerity, filled with chintz cushions, a vase of fresh flowers, and a shelf of novels that hinted at a lively mind. Mrs. Tate appeared moments later, her dark hair swept up in a stylish knot, her dress a cheerful shade of green that seemed to defy the village's somber mood. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with a smile that was both welcoming and guarded. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "What a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Clement mentioned you were visiting. Do sit down, I'll ring for tea." She gestured to a cushioned chair by the fire, her movements graceful but deliberate. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes taking in the room's details: the polished silver teapot, the framed watercolor of a seaside view, the faint scent of lavender that hung in the air. "You're very kind, Mrs. Tate," she said, her smile disarming. "I've heard such good things about you at the parish tea. You're quite the supporter of St. Mary's, I understand." Laura's smile widened, but her eyes were watchful. "I do what I can. The church is the heart of the village, don't you think? Poor Reverend Hargrove, he was such a steady presence. His loss is dreadful." Her voice held a note of sorrow, but Miss Marple sensed a careful control, as if the words were chosen with care. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her needles emerging from her bag, their soft clicking a familiar rhythm. It's a shocking thing to lose him so violently, and in his own study. I was speaking with Mr. Denning, the curate, and he mentioned how much you've supported his ideas for the parish. He must value your encouragement. Laura's fingers paused on the teapot, and a faint flush rose to her cheeks. Philip, Mr. Denning is full of energy, she said, pouring the tea with a steady hand. He wants to bring new life to the church, and I think that's admirable. The vicar was more traditional, but Philip has vision. Her tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the warmth in her voice when she spoke of the curate, a warmth that went beyond mere admiration. She sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but probing. Vision is a fine thing, she said. In St. Mary Mead, we had a young man quite like Mr. Denning, who stirred things up with his ideas. The ladies were quite taken with him, though it led to some talk. Villages do love their gossip, don't they? Laura's laugh was bright, but it held an edge. Oh, they do. People will talk about anything, a glance, a smile. It's harmless, mostly. She set her cup down, her fingers brushing a lavender sachet on the table, its scent wafting faintly. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind sharp. Harmless, perhaps, but troubling when it touches someone like the vicar. I hear he was concerned about certain lapses in the parish. Did he ever speak to you about such things? Laura's smile faltered, and her eyes flicked toward the window, as if seeking escape. He was a serious man, she said carefully, always fretting about the parish's morals. He spoke to me once about attending services regularly, but nothing specific. I'm a widow. Miss Marple people watch me more closely than most. Her voice was light, but Miss Marple caught a trace of defensiveness, a hint of something unspoken. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. It must be difficult, living under such scrutiny. And this morning, when the vicar was found, such a dreadful moment. Were you at home, perhaps, or visiting the church? Laura's fingers tightened on her cup, and she hesitated before answering. I was here, in the cottage. I don't go out early, not usually. I heard about it later, when the village started buzzing. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause, the way her eyes avoided meeting hers. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple, steering the conversation to village matters, the fete, the choir watching Laura's responses. The widow was charming, quick to laugh, but there was a wariness in her, a careful dance around certain topics. As Miss Marple rose to leave, her eyes fell on a shawl draped over a chair, its green wool strikingly similar to the scarf in the vicarage hall. A small lavender sachet was pinned to it, its scent mingling with the room's air. Thank you, Mrs. Tate, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's chatter. I hope we'll meet again soon. Laura nodded, her smile polite but guarded. Any time, Miss Marple. Do call if you're passing. As Miss Marple stepped into the garden, the breeze carried the lavender scent with her, a reminder of the thread she was following. She paused by the gate, noting a trampled patch of grass, as if someone had stood there recently, perhaps watching the cottage. Her mind turned to Philip Denning, his nervous energy, his vague account of the morning, and the lavender scent that linked him to Laura Tate. The diary's mention of a moral lapse loomed large, and she pictured the vicar, confronting his curate, his disapproval, a spark that might have ignited panic in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had known a young woman, much like Laura, whose charm had drawn a man into indiscretion, leading to whispered scandals and a broken engagement. Was Laura Tate's connection with Philip more than friendship, and had the vicar's discovery threatened them both? The stole, used so deliberately, suggested a crime born of desperation, a need to silence a judgment that could ruin lives. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the other suspects Eleanor's quiet resentment, Clara's fierce devotion, Lily's secretive dreams. Each had a reason to fear the vicar's scrutiny. But Philip's link to Laura felt like a key, a piece that might unlock the puzzle. She recalled the green thread on the church gate, the mother-of-pearl button in the vicarage garden, and now, the green shawl in Laura's parlor. They were small things, but in her experience, small things led to great truths as she walked back toward the rectory. The church bell tolled noon, its sound clear and solemn. Miss Marple's resolve strengthened. The lavender clue pointed to Philip, but it also raised questions about Laura's role. Had she been complicit, or merely a catalyst? The diary's secrets, the stoles, symbolism, the fragments scattered across St. Mary's, they were drawing together, forming a pattern she could almost see. Her next step, she decided, was to share her thoughts with Inspector Craddock, to test the thread of Philip's affair and see where it led. With a quiet nod to herself, Miss Jane Marple continued down the lane, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next knot in the tapestry of the vicar's death. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary's, its light filtering through the yews in the churchyard and painting the vicarage garden with a golden haze. Miss Jane Marple sat in the rectory's small sitting room, her knitting needles idle for once, her mind turning over the threads of the vicar's murder like a weaver at her loom. The lavender scent on Philip Denning's cassock, the green shawl in Laura Tate's parlor, the diary's cryptic warnings. They were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a secret affair, one the vicar had likely discovered. Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, but it was a delicate thing, requiring careful handling to avoid snapping the thread. She had shared her suspicions with Inspector Craddock, who had agreed to bring Laura Tate to the vicarage for questioning, a move that might shake loose the truth. The vicarage parlor, where Miss Marple now waited with Craddock, was a familiar space, its chintz, curtains, and polished furniture a quiet backdrop to the tension that hung in the air. The fire crackled softly, and a tray of tea things sat untouched on the side table, the silver pot gleaming in the fading light. Craddock stood by the window, his broad frame restless, his eyes scanning the garden path where Laura Tate would soon appear. "I hope you're right about this, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, but edged with anticipation. "If Mrs. Tate and Denning are hiding something, we'll need more than lavender and gossip to pin it down." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her hands folded over her knitting bag. "Patience, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I once unraveled a theft by noticing a single misplaced teacup. Small things lead to larger ones, if we watch closely. Mrs. Tate, story and Mr. Dennings may tell us more than they intend." The door opened, and Laura Tate entered, her green dress vibrant against the parlor's muted tones. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a flicker of unease as she nodded to Craddock and Miss Marple. "Inspector, Miss Marple," she said, her voice bright but strained. "I came as soon as I got your message. I hope I can help, though I'm not sure what more I can say." Craddock gestured to a chair, his manner brisk but polite. "Sit down, Mrs. Tate. We're trying to piece together the morning of Reverend Hargrove's death. You told Miss Marple you were at home, but we need to be certain of everyone's movements. You understand, I'm sure." Laura sat, her hand smoothing her skirt with a nervous grace. "Of course, Inspector. I was at my cottage, as I said. I didn't go out until I heard the news about the vicar." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, who sat quietly, her expression one of gentle curiosity. Craddock leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Mrs. Tate, there's talk in the village about you and Mr. Denning. You've been seen together often walks by the mill, quiet talks after services. The vicar's diary mentioned a moral lapse concerning his curate. Care to shed light on that?" Laura's cheeks flushed, and her fingers tightened on the arm of the chair. Village gossip, she said, her voice sharp. Mr. Denning and I are friends. He's a kind man, full of ideas for the church. People see what they want to see. Her tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flickered, as if searching for an escape. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a breeze. No one doubts your kindness, Mrs. Tate, but friendships can grow complicated, especially under a vicar's watchful eye. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a young widow who found solace in a friendship, only to have it misunderstood. Did the vicar ever speak to you about Mr. Denning? Perhaps caution you? Laura's lips parted, then closed, her gaze dropping to her hands. He did, once, she admitted, her voice low. A few weeks ago, after evensong, he said, I should be mindful of appearances, that the parish looked to me as an example. I told him there was nothing improper, but he seemed concerned. Her fingers twisted a ring on her hand, a small gesture that Miss Marple catalogued. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Concerned enough to confront Denning, perhaps. His diary suggests he urged the curate to confess something. What was it, Mrs. Tate? Laura's face paled, and she rose, her hands clenched. I don't know what you're implying, Inspector. Philip and we've done nothing wrong. Yes, we've grown close, but it's not what you think. We met that morning at my cottage, before the vicar was found. He was with me from 7 until nearly 8. He couldn't have been at the vicarage. Her voice trembled, but there was a fierceness in it, a determination to protect. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. How comforting for Mr. Denning to have such a friend, she said. But it's curious, isn't it, that he didn't mention this when we spoke. He said he was in his room, writing a sermon. Why keep your meeting a secret, do you think? Laura's flush deepened, and she looked away, toward the fire. He wanted to protect me. The village talks, Miss Marple, a widow and a curate people, would make it into something it's not. He thought it best to say nothing. Her voice was steady now, but Miss Marple sensed a thread of truth stretched thin, as if Laura were shielding more than she revealed. Craddock's voice was firm. Mrs. Tate, if Denning was with you, we'll need to verify that. And if he lied about his whereabouts, it raises questions. The vicar was killed between 7 and 8, by the doctor's estimate. Your cottage is a 10-minute walk from the vicarage, plenty of time for him to slip back. Laura's eyes widened, and she shook her head. No, that's impossible. He was with me the whole time. We were talking about the youth group, planning a meeting. He left just before I heard Mrs. Hargrove's scream from the village. Her voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in it, the need to convince. Before Craddock could press further, the door opened, and Philip Denning entered, summoned by the constable. His face was pale, his eyes darting from Laura to Craddock, then to Miss Marple. What's this about? He asked, his voice tight. I've told you where I was upstairs, working. Craddock's gaze was steely. Mrs. Tate says otherwise. Denning, she claims you were at her cottage from 7 to 8. Care to explain why you lied? Philip's jaw clenched, and he glanced at Laura, a silent plea in his eyes. I didn't want to cause trouble for her, he said, his voice low. The village would talk, and Laura doesn't deserve that. Yes, I was with her. We were discussing parish matters. I got back to the vicarage, just as Mrs. Hargrove screamed. His hands fidgeted, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of lavender. Fainter now, but still present. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, cutting through the tension. Mr. Denning, it's admirable to protect a friend, but secrets can be dangerous. The vicar's diary mentioned a moral lapse, a confrontation with you. Was it about Mrs. Tate? Did he threaten to expose you? Philip's face flushed, and he ran a hand through his hair. He'd misunderstood, he said, his voice breaking. He saw us together, thought it was improper. I told him it was nothing, just friendship. but he wouldn't listen. He said I was risking my calling, that I had to end it. I was angry, but I didn't. Miss Marple, I swear I didn't hurt him. His eyes were wide, pleading, and Miss Marple saw the fear in them, the fear of a man caught in a web of his own making. Laura reached out, her hand brushing his arm, but she withdrew it quickly under Craddock's gaze. He's telling the truth, Inspector, she said. Philip was with me. He couldn't have done it. Craddock's expression was unyielding. We'll check the timing, Mrs. Tate. And Denning, you'll stay close until we do. Lying about your whereabouts doesn't help your case. As Philip and Laura exchanged a glance, Miss Marple's mind raced. The timing was tight, 10 minutes from the cottage to the vicarage, a narrow window for murder. Philip's lie suggested fear, but of what? Exposure of an affair, or something more? The lavender scent, the green shawl, the diary's warning, they pointed to Philip. But Laura's fierce defense muddied the waters. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen lovers protect each other, even at great cost, and she wondered if Laura's alibi was truth or loyalty. As Craddock escorted Laura and Philip out, Miss Marple lingered in the parlor, her eyes falling on the photograph of the Hargroves, its frame still tilted. The diary's words echoed in her mind: Philip's lapse, Clara's zeal, Lily's heart. The stole, used so deliberately, suggested a personal act, a silencing of judgment. Philip's fear, Laura's defense, they were pieces, but the pattern was not yet clear. She thought of the green thread, the mother-of-pearl button, and the rose petal. Small clues that tugged at her memory. Rising, Miss Marple felt the weight of the truth drawing near. The confrontation had revealed much, but not enough. She needed to see the suspects together, to watch their faces, their silences. The memorial service, planned for tomorrow, would bring them all under one roof, and Miss Jane Marple knew that in such moments, the truth often slipped through the cracks. With a quiet resolve, she stepped into the fading light, ready to unravel the next thread in the tapestry of St. Mary's tragedy. Chapter 11. The final thread. The morning of Reverend Thomas Hargrove's memorial service dawned with a quiet solemnity. The sky over St. Mary's, a pale gray that seemed to mirror the village's muted grief. The church was filled with the soft murmur of parishioners, their faces drawn as they gathered to honor the fallen vicar. Miss Jane Marple sat in a pew near the back, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag tucked discreetly at her side. Her eyes, sharp and unobtrusive, moved over the congregation, noting the subtle interplay of glances and silences among those closest to the vicar's life. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and wax, and the organ, under Clara Vane's skilled hands, poured forth a mournful prelude that seemed to weave the village's sorrow into sound. Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of threads, each clue a strand she had carefully gathered. The lavender scent, linking Philip Denning to Laura Tate. The green thread on the church gate, the mother-of-pearl button in the vicarage garden, the rose petal in the study, and the diary's cryptic warnings of moral lapses, fanatical devotion, and a heart to be protected. The confrontation with Philip and Laura had tightened the weave, revealing a secret affair and a lie about Philip's whereabouts. But the pattern was not yet complete. Today, in the church's hallowed space, she hoped to see the final thread that would tie it all together. In the front pew, Eleanor Hargrove sat rigid, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale face. Her hands were clasped tightly, a handkerchief crumpled between them, and her eyes remained fixed on the altar, where a portrait of the vicar rested amid flowers. Miss Marple noted the absence of tears, the controlled grief that spoke of duty rather than despair. Beside her, Lily Ward sat with downcast eyes, her pale hair veiled by a black hat, her fingers fidgeting with a small prayer book. The faint bruise on her wrist was hidden by a long sleeve, but Miss Marple's memory held the image. A silent question about the girl's secrets. Philip Denning stood near the pulpit, his cassock immaculate but his face pale, his hands restless as he adjusted his prayer book. The lavender scent was faint today, but Miss Marple's keen senses caught it. A reminder of his link to Laura Tate, who sat a few pews away, her green shawl draped over her shoulders. Clara Vane, at the organ, played with a fierce intensity, her sharp features set in a mask of devotion, her eyes occasionally darting toward Lily and Philip with a glint of disapproval. The congregation was a microcosm of St. Mary's, each face a story. But Miss Marple's focus was on these four, their tensions a silent undercurrent to the service. As the vicar's curate, Philip delivered a brief eulogy, his voice steady but strained. Reverend Hargrove was a man of faith, he said, a shepherd who guided us with wisdom and care. His loss is a wound to us all, but his teachings live on. His words were heartfelt, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided Laura's, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the pulpit. Was it grief or guilt? Clara's organ swelled into a hymn, nearer, my God, to thee, and the congregation rose, their voices blending in somber harmony. Miss Marple stood with them, her lips moving but her eyes never still. She saw hands tighten, Lily's head bow lower, and Philip's gaze flicker toward the vestry door, where a green scarf hung on a hook, its woolen threads catching the light. Laura's shawl slipped slightly, revealing a mother-of-pearl button on her dress, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, the button matching the one she had seen in the garden, as the hymn ended. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues together. The diary had spoken of Philip's moral lapse, likely his affair with Laura, which the vicar had confronted. Clara's zeal had troubled the vicar, her protectiveness a potential spark for violence. Lily's heart, drawn to an unworthy suitor, perhaps Tom Fletcher had worried him, suggesting a secret romance he sought to end. Eleanor's quiet resentment, her hidden photograph, hinted at a marriage grown cold. But the stole, used so deliberately, pointed to a personal act, a silencing of the vicar's judgment. The green thread, the button, the lavender scent, they circled Philip. Yet Laura's alibi complicated the timeline. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to a story from St. Mary Mead, where a young man, fearing ruin over a scandal, had acted in desperation to protect his future. Philip's ambition, his fear of exposure, mirrored that tale. She pictured him in the study, the vicar's stern words echoing. The stole at hand, a symbol of authority turned weapon in a moment of panic. The lack of struggle suggested trust, someone the vicar allowed close. Philip's lie about his whereabouts, his nervous energy, the lavender linking him to Laura, they were damning, yet the timing gnawed at her. Laura's insistence that he was with her until 8 left a narrow window, but a possible one. As the service ended, the congregation filed out, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the suspects as they moved toward the church door. Eleanor paused to speak with a parishioner, her face a mask of composure. Lily slipped out quickly, her head bowed, avoiding Clara's gaze. Philip lingered by the vestry, his hands in his pockets, his eyes darting to Laura, who stood alone, adjusting her shawl. Clara descended from the organ loft, her hymn book clutched tightly, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple approached Craddock, who stood near the altar, his notebook open. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe we're close. The diary, the stole, the lavender, they point to a truth we can't ignore. Mr. Denning's affair with Mrs. Tate was a secret the vicar knew, one he threatened to expose. His lie about that morning, the green thread, the button, they suggest he was near the vicarage, despite his claims." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You're thinking Denning then. But Mrs. Tate's alibi, he was with her until 8. The doctor says the vicar died around 7:30. It's tight." Miss Marple nodded, her voice calm. Tight, but not impossible. A quick walk, a moment of desperation. The stole was there, a symbol of the vicar's authority. Philip knew it well, knew its meaning. In St. Mary Mead, I saw a man act rashly to protect his reputation. I fear it's the same here. Craddock rubbed his chin, considering. We'll bring him in again. Go over the timeline. If he slipped away from the cottage, someone might have seen him. And that button, you think it's from Mrs. Tate's dress? It may be, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. Small things, Inspector, are often the key. The button, the thread, the petal, they tell a story, if we listen. As Craddock moved to organize his men, Miss Marple stepped into the churchyard, her gaze lingering on the vicarage garden. The memorial service had been a mirror, reflecting the suspects' fears and secrets. Philip's guilt, Laura's loyalty, Clara's zeal, Lily's silence, Eleanor's restraint. They were all threads, but one led to the heart of the crime. Miss Marple felt the pattern forming, the truth almost within reach. The final confrontation, she knew, would come soon, when the suspects gathered again, and she would be ready to pull the final thread. With a quiet resolve, she walked back to the rectory, her mind as sharp as the needles in her bag, prepared to unravel the last knot in St. Mary's tragedy. Chapter 12. The revelation. The vicarage parlor was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its chintz curtains drawn against the evening chill that settled over St. Mary's. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The room was filled with a quiet tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his broad frame casting a shadow across the polished floor. Before them, gathered at Miss Marple's request, were the four suspects: Eleanor Hargrove, Philip Denning, Clara Vane, and Lily Ward. Each sat stiffly, their faces a study in guarded emotion. Eleanor's pale composure, Philip's nervous agitation, Clara's stern resolve, and Lily's wide-eyed unease. The memorial service had tightened the threads of the mystery, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to weave them into a final pattern. Craddock cleared his throat, his voice firm but measured. Miss Marple has something to say, he began, glancing at her with a mix of respect and curiosity. She's been kind enough to share her observations, and I think you'll all want to hear them. Go ahead, Miss Marple. She smiled, her eyes gentle but piercing as they moved over the group. Thank you, Inspector. I'm only an old woman, fond of knitting and village life, but I've learned that people are much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or St. Mary's. They carry their hopes, their fears, their secrets, and sometimes those secrets lead to tragedy. Reverend Hargrove's death was no random act. It was personal, deliberate, and born of a heart that felt trapped. Eleanor's hands tightened on her handkerchief, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Philip shifted in his chair, his face pale, while Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, her hymn book clutched like a shield. Lily's fingers plucked at her sleeve, her bruise hidden but not forgotten. Miss Marple's voice was soft, cutting through the silence like a thread through fabric. Let us begin with the stole, she said, her tone calm. A sacred object, used to silence a man of faith. It was no accident, that choice. It was a message, a rebuke to the vicar's authority. Someone in this room knew his habits, knew where to find that stole, and used it to end his judgment forever. She paused, her eyes resting on Philip. Mr. Denning, the vicar's diary spoke of a moral lapse and a confrontation with you. You admitted to an attachment with Mrs. Tate, one the vicar disapproved of. You lied about your whereabouts that morning, claiming you were in your room when you were with her at her cottage. Why lie, unless you feared what he knew? Philip's face flushed, and he leaned forward, his voice tight. I told you, Miss Marple, I lied to protect Laura's reputation. The vicar was wrong about us. It was friendship, nothing more. I was at her cottage until 8, when I heard Mrs. Hargrove scream. I couldn't have done it. His eyes darted to Laura, who sat outside the parlor, waiting in the hall at Craddock's request. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Perhaps, but the timing is close, Mr. Denning. A 10-minute walk from the cottage to the vicarage. A moment of panic tits possible. The lavender scent on your cassock, The green scarf in the hall, the thread on the church gate they place. You near the scene, and the vicar's warning, his threat to expose you, might have felt like ruin. Clara's voice cut in, sharp and cold. He's right to fear exposure. His behavior was a disgrace to the church. The vicar saw it, and I saw it. To those secret meetings, that woman's laughter, it was shameful. Her eyes blazed, and Miss Marple noted the fervor. The same intensity the diary had called fanatical. Miss Vane, Miss Marple said gently, your devotion to the vicar was profound. His diary noted your zeal, your tendency to judge others harshly. Did you resent his attention to Lily, perhaps, or his tolerance of Mr. Denning's ideas? The stole was a symbol you knew well, one you might have used to protect his sanctity. Clara's face paled, and she clutched her hymn book tighter. I would never harm him. He was a saint, Miss Marple. I only wanted to honor him, to keep the church pure. It was others who brought shame. Lily with her, sneaking about, and him. She pointed at Philip, her voice trembling with indignation. Miss Marple's gaze turned to Lily, who shrank back, her eyes wide. Miss Ward, the vicar worried for your heart, fearing you were drawn to someone unworthy. I've heard talk of Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith's son. That bruise on your wrist. Your secrecy. Did the vicar confront you, perhaps try to stop you from seeing him? Lily's lips trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. He didn't understand, she whispered. Tom's good, but the vicar said he wasn't right for me. He wanted me to marry someone else, someone proper. I didn't hurt him, Miss Marple. I was in my room, I swear. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple's heart ached for the girl, but her mind remained clear. Finally, she looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hargrove, you lived quietly, dutifully, but the vicar's diary showed a man absorbed in his work, leaving little room for warmth. That photograph, hidden face down, speaks of a distance between you. Did his judgments, his distance, grow too heavy to bear? Eleanor's eyes met Miss Marple's, steady but shadowed. I loved Thomas, in my way, she said, her voice low. He was the parish, not just my husband. I accepted it. I was in the kitchen that morning, preparing breakfast. I didn't see anything. Her words were calm, but her hands twisted the handkerchief. A silent tell. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. One of you entered that study, took the stole, and used it to silence the vicar. The diary tells us why Mr. Denning's affair was the key. Reverend Hargrove confronted you, Philip, urging you to end it with Mrs. Tate or face exposure. You feared ruin, the loss of your calling. You knew the vicarage, knew the stole's place in the study. You slipped in, perhaps after leaving Laura's cottage, and acted in a moment of desperation. Philip's face crumpled, and he rose, his voice breaking. No, I didn't, Miss Marple, I couldn't. Yes, he confronted me, said I'd disgraced the church. I was angry, but I was with Laura. I didn't. He stopped, his hands shaking, and sank back into his chair, his eyes pleading. Laura's voice came from the doorway, sharp and urgent. He's telling the truth, Inspector. He was with me, until 8. He couldn't have done it. Craddock held up a hand, silencing her, but Miss Marple's eyes remained on Philip.